at the NATO summit, okay, you had NATO essentially first did it again. It invited New Zealand, Australia, South Korea, Japan. There was that dynamic. So there was that dynamic, and that angered China. China said, "Why are you inviting regional partners? Why are you inviting regional countries? The North Atlantic is way over there. Asia Pacific is way over here. NATO, you have no jurisdiction. You probably shouldn't exist anyway. You have no jurisdiction over anything. Your purpose basically became irrelevant when the Soviet Union fell, but you definitely don't have any place in Asia." So not only were these countries invited, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, just like the last summit last year, but you also had a statement, a joint communique that made China be out to be a threat. And you also had the floating of a possible liaison office opening in Tokyo. And all of this angered China, and rightfully so. And here's what China had to say. This is from Al Jazeera. So China had this to say. China promises a resolute response to any NATO expansion in Asia. And Beijing rejects NATO concern over its stated ambitions, criticizes presence of Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and South Korea at the summit. So, in a strongly worded statement issued halfway through their 2-day summit in Lithuania, NATO leaders said that the People's Republic of China challenged the alliance's interests, security, and values with its stated ambitions and coercive policies. So here you go again. The PRC employs a broad range of political, economic, military tools to increase its global footprint and project power while remaining opaque about its strategy, intentions, and military buildup. The PRC's malicious hybrid and cyber operations and its confrontational rhetoric and disinformation target allies and harm alliance security. So this is like a copy and paste of last year's joint communique, by the way. This is exactly what they said last year. So not much has changed, really. But this was also a big addition where they talked about Russia and China's partnership being a threat. The leaders urged China to play a constructive role as one of 5 permanent veto-holding members of the UN Security Council and condemned Russia's war of aggression of Ukraine. So the Chinese mission to the European Union condemned these comments and said they firmly rejected and opposed this. So you had these 4 countries invited. You also had a liaison office floated, but it did not make it out of the summit because European countries essentially said we can't have all of that. We can't take that. That's going to anger China to a degree that we just can't afford. So that was scrapped for at least the time being. No NATO liaison office in Tokyo. However, China was still very much giving stern warnings to Europe because many things had happened even before this. And I'm just going to show you the Global Times. Really good to read the Global Times if you want to know what China's government is thinking about these things. They put out really quick statements, oftentimes directly related from the government. And here you have a warning that China warns NATO against destabilizing the Asia Pacific, and talking about how Chinese analysts are saying that the joint communique released by NATO basically shows a greater level of hostility toward China. These analysts and Chinese leadership slam the message, warning that China needs to be prepared for an increased NATO presence in Asia, and said the internal divergences among U.S.-led alliance will only increase if it continues its unwise expansion to the rest of the world, while existing security problems in Europe were already severe. China firmly opposes NATO's eastward expansion in the Asia-Pacific region, and its characterization of China as a systemic challenge. The NATO communique this year claimed that China's ambitions and coercive policies challenge interest, security, and values. So China is warning. China is saying, do not do this, right? That it's a product of a Cold War. And the Chinese mission says that it will firmly safeguard Chinese sovereignty, security, and development interests, and firmly opposes NATO's eastward movement to the Asia Pacific. In response to the NATO summit declaration that accuses the Russia-China relationship of undercutting the rules-based international order, Chinese Foreign Ministry said on Wednesday that China-Russia relations are based on principles of non-alignment, non-confrontation, and non-targeting of third countries. Wang Wenbin, who is a spokesperson of the Ministry of Affairs of China, said, "We urge NATO to stop groundless accusations, provocative remarks against China, and that it should give up the wrong approach of seeking absolute security, stop messing up Europe, and stop trying to destabilize the Asia Pacific and the world. Amen." So now this comes, right? So China, China is ready for all of this, and believe me, I know. When I was there are discussions about this. There are preparations for war. Xi Jinping says it many times. Every time he's talking about security, every time he visits the People's Liberation Army, especially off Fujian province, especially when it is in relation to Taiwan. China is ready. China is ready for this, okay? And so here's the thing. While I was in China, leading up to the NATO summit, a lot was already happening between Europe, especially European NATO countries, and China in the economic realm. So really, a lot was being laid before the NATO summit, which is just as important because all of this stated, oh, China's a threat, China's this, that was to be expected given last year's joint communique. It was very similar. Adding the Russia-China partnership into there, as well as reaffirming that China is a threat to security interests, values of the collective West, all of this is kind of par for the course. But I think what is really interesting about this moment is that European countries are walking a very, how should I say, dangerous tightrope with China. Because, as you all know, Europe has already destroyed itself economically in many ways through its sanctions on Russia. Now they seem to be doing the same with China. So, in the lead up to this summit in July, in the first few weeks of July, you had Europe release this economic security and trade document, economic security and trade document, basically saying that China was both a partner, competitor, and a systemic rival, and that it was going to de-risk and diversify as needed to build a stable supply chain not threatened by economic intimidation. So the EU, which, mind you, the EU and NATO, you can't separate the two. NATO is the military projection of U.S. dominance via mainly European countries. The European countries are really the most important ones in NATO. Okay. Don't come at me for not saying Turkey is important because it's big military and it's non-aligned stance and it's how it plays all sides. Yes, I know Turkey's important, but let's be honest. Who really calls the shots here? There's a reason why Turkey's not in the EU, even though it got assurances supposedly that it will. It's not going to happen, but that's why I didn't even mention it earlier, because I don't believe it's even worth mentioning. But nonetheless, you have the European Union is concerned about growing tensions in the Taiwan Strait, they said in the document, and opposes unilateral attempts of force. So crossing China's red line there. So essentially saying in this document that they're going to ease economic ties with China, similar to how the U.S. has been building up an economic war. What do you think this did for China? Do you think that this made China happy? Do you think it gave China hope that after all of those visits from Olaf Scholz and Emmanuel Macron, and you had so many visits of European business people and all of this saying, "Oh, no, we don't want to decouple." You had all of that happen, throughout the spring. And then what happened? This happened. So this document angered China so much that they canceled Jungle Josep Borrell's potential visit. And here is that headline. So this happened in early June. Borrell was due to arrive on Monday, that was around the July 4th holiday, to meet Qin Gang, Chinese foreign minister, and the European Union was told that the planned timing of the visit no longer is possible. So China canceled the visit, and that they were informed by the Chinese counterparts that the envisaged dates are no longer possible and that we must now look for alternatives. And no alternatives have yet to be announced. So you have essentially Europe angering China to a degree that it was willing to cancel a pretty high level meeting with Josep Borrell, and after it came after this document. Okay, and that's not all though. That's not all, because this document was an indication to China that the tech war, the economic war led by the US, was also going to include Europe to an even greater degree now. And so China took pretty big measures here. Here you have the EU desperate because China basically started to put in export controls of precious metals needed for the tech industry, and solar panels, electric vehicles, etc., for their export. So China basically said, well, we have these metals, we will produce them for ourselves, and we can withhold them if we want to. That is our sovereign right, especially if you're going to engage in economic war against us at the behest of your US master. And so the EU is now trying to beg, this was about a week ago, but is trying to beg China to release them, to ease them up. But why would China do that? Why would China do that? So basically, there's these two key metals, right? That they restricted, gallium and germanium, that they essentially restricted for export in response really to the US's export ban. But a lot of European countries have essentially listened to this export ban. And now with this EU security and trade agreement, it's an indication that they're going to step up aligning their policy with the United States. And so, when I was in China, and I'll just say this about my China trip, and for everyone who's watching this on the replay or the clip video, be sure to catch in more detail information and the report back on this trip. But when I was on this trip, I was told by my Chinese counterparts that it has made a big difference. And while now Huawei is just getting out, the huge corporation that makes and produces a lot of the 5G technology and the high tech industry in China through telecommunications, this corporation is now getting out of it. And there has been a lot of internal investment that has helped bring China's tech industry back to more normal levels, but it's still behind because of these export controls and these sanctions. And so the export controls against China has basically mobilized the world in an attempt to cut off China from needed materials and parts to produce semiconductor chips, especially the advanced kind. And what that has done is you'll have a situation, and I was told this by my Chinese counterparts, that Huawei's Mate phones, right? The latest, I think it's Mate 15, didn't have 5G technology in it because of the export ban. And so essentially people weren't buying it. They had to stay with their 14s. And I think now that is something that's going to be a thing of the past very soon. But this has been months and months and months since October 7th of 2022, where this has been a reality for Huawei. So these sanctions, these export controls have had an effect, and China lashed back as you would expect them to. But yeah, here's the consequences, and I'll close here on this subject. This is what happens, okay? And maybe we should consider part of this a good thing, because it's been a good thing for Russia. It'll be a good thing for China as well in the long term, the short-term consequences notwithstanding. But now Huawei is poised to overcome the US ban, which includes European countries following it and Asian countries as well, with return of 5G phones. So China's Huawei technology is plotting a return of the 5G smartphone industry by the end of this year, according to research firms, signaling a comeback after a U.S. ban on equipment sales decimated its consumer electronics business. Huawei should be able to produce or procure 5G chips domestically using its own advances in semiconductor design tools, along with the chip making from SMIC, Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation, 3 third-party technology research firms covering China's smartphone sector. The firms, citing industry sources including Huawei suppliers, spoke on condition of anonymity because of confidentiality agreement with clients. Huawei declined to comment. SMIC did not respond to a request for comment. A return to the 5G phone market would mark a victory for the company that for almost 3 years said it was in survival mode. Huawei's consumer business revenue peaked at $483 billion in 2020 before plummeting by 50% a year later. That was due to sanctions and it only became worse from there. So Huawei was stuck selling 4G headsets during the export control ban, and it fell from its worldwide rankings during that time, but now is back on the rise. So I just wanted to cover that in full. That is the NATO summit. That is its impact on China in particular. China was not happy about this. And why should China be happy about this? This was a disaster for China. It was a disaster for the world. And now we are going to see what happens next. In my opinion, this does indicate that China is a target of NATO. And politically, it makes a lot of sense as to why. If NATO is the military arm, a projected military arm, a global military arm of U.S. hegemony, then U.S. hegemony, seeing China as the principal threat to its very existence, of course, is going to use all of the means at its disposal to try to depose of this threat. So when we talk about China, quote unquote, threat, we should not talk about China being a threat in the literal sense, that somehow China is nefarious and trying to work around the United States, trying to dominate the United States, trying to undermine the West, all of this. No, China wants cooperation. China has been very consistent in its policy of, if you respect our sovereignty, we will cooperate with you to the fullest extent. And even if you don't, we will cooperate with you in the interest of stability and economic well-being and interest. We will do so anyway. But there are red lines. Taiwan, as well as the sanctions, all of these things are red lines for China, and China will respond. So that is the political situation that is an outgrowth of these policies in the geopolitical realm. The politics of the situation are that NATO is setting its sight on China to an even further degree because it is well aware that it has not succeeded against Russia. And that if it's going to fight this two-front war, it is going to have to kind of jump back and forth between the two in order to have any kind of impact or effect. And of course, there are impacts and there are effects, as the Huawei situation shows pretty remarkably. However, the consequences of this are going to be that China's not going to collapse. It's not going to fall. It's not going to even necessarily weaken. Even in periods like this one, which is an economic slowdown for China, it is a slower economic period for China for a lot of reasons, but namely because the whole world situation is in economic distress. But even so, this is a moment also of consolidation, of self-reliance, and of China's ability, which I think is even greater than Russia's, to depend and rely upon the entire world outside and excluding the US and Europe in order to meet its own domestic imperatives as well as its many, many, many international and foreign policy imperatives, which all point to a respect for sovereignty, peace, international law, and the like. So that is only going to grow. That is only going to strengthen. That is only going to get better for China. Even as times are hard, both things can exist at the same time. So that's the political situation we need to be aware of. When we're looking at this NATO summit, we have to be aware of that the targets of NATO are only going to get stronger. And that is a good thing. However, the caution, the danger lies in the fact that every time these countries get stronger, NATO becomes more aggressive. That's where the danger lies. And that's why we have to be on the lookout after this summit, not necessarily in these words or in the drama or even in the futility and weakness of NATO itself, but in the fact that the more weak it gets, the more hampered it becomes, the more dangerous it will become, the more likely it will do something that maybe we would not imagine it doing given the rhetoric that it is stating right now. Even as hostile and aggressive as it is, we should be thinking that it is possible for a greater war to happen because of essentially NATO's position leading it basically backing itself into a corner, leading itself into a corner. Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyHaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.